Good afternoon. Welcome to another installment of our discussion on emergency management that we are doing for our Introduction to Emergency Management class here at Ohio Christian University. So today, what I want to talk about for a few minutes is vulnerability. We spend a lot of time in class talking about it, and I think I need to set aside a few minutes and do sort of an informational session on vulnerability, what that looks like, and assessing it, that sort of thing. And so we're going to talk for just a couple minutes. I just want to clarify. We talk about it in class a lot, but just so there's no confusion about what this looks like. So communities, they can look at sort of the intervention in sort of an event happens, emergency happens, some disaster happens. There's really sort of two types of effects that impact, right? The first is physical, and these can be reduced by hazard mitigation practices or sort of emergency preparedness, that sort of stuff, right? So this is the how it impacts the buildings, how it impacts the crops in the area, that sort of stuff. Those are the physical things. The second is the sort of the social, and that sort of floats sort of under the radar to some degree. And while you hear a lot about the number of deaths and the number of buildings destroyed, which are ways that we sort of gauge the physical impacts, you hear less about the sort of social impacts. And I would argue that those social impacts are in many cases more important and harder to deal with. I would much rather have somebody lose their house than lose their livelihood, right? You can rebuild a house and you can get somebody a new job, but right, their identity and stuff that's wrapped up in a livelihood, that's a little harder to replace. So, we talk about emergency preparedness practice for physical. For the social, that's going to be on that recovery end. And that's why I say, it's going to probably take a lot longer, right? We know that as it's ramping up to the event happening, and that's our response, right? That response, as soon as it's over, it gets back down. And it's very long. That long-term recovery is long, and that's where a lot of the social impacts and the effects, the ripple that goes out, they're addressed in sort of at that place. So, physical. Let's talk for a minute about the physical impacts. Right? I said, those are number of deaths, the casualties. This is a pretty good way to sort of box up the level of damage. That's how we like to measure impacts, right? So we say that this particular storm and this particular hurricane caused this many millions of dollars worth of damages, or it cost this many lives. That is a physical way to gauge the the size and the impact of an event, right? It's harder to gauge that social piece because some of those effects may not show up instantaneously. Some of the effects may be, trauma that doesn't pop up until 6 months down the road. And then at that point, it's a little harder to connect, this happened, so this happened, right? It cause and effect. It's a little looser connection when it comes to some of the social impacts. I talk a lot in class about socio-economic and that sort of thing, and really if you think about it, what causes someone? So I am affected by a hurricane, and then down the street, my neighbor is also impacted by the same hurricane. I have a good job. I have a good network of people. I have friends and family outside of the area. I can pull out my credit card and I can, purchase a few nights in a hotel. I have the ability to some degree, the social impacts of an event, it's not gonna socially impact me quite the same way it might my neighbor down the street, who maybe doesn't have as good a job, doesn't know a lot of people outside of his area, right? His social network is very small. Maybe he doesn't have a license. One of the things we found with people in New Orleans, you live in a big urban area, there's not a lot of need to have a car when there's public transportation, and then cars are expensive, right? Because you end up having to pay gas and insurance, so on and so forth. And in that urban area, you don't need a car. We're in Central Ohio, where we don't really have much in the way of public transportation, so you have to have a car to get somewhere. The poor have fewer resources. The people on that sort of lower rung in the socioeconomic sort of strata, they're more likely to sort of remain in their sort of the damaged homes, or a home that maybe I wouldn't stay in. They're forced to stay in it because they don't have any choices, right? They don't have any ability to do anything else, right? There are some long-term, and I spoke about this, but there's some long-term social impacts of these events, right? One of the biggest, I would call them victims of this sort of thing, is immigrants, but also not just immigrants coming, but also people who immigrate. So people who come and go, based on why they're coming. Sometimes, based on why they find themselves where they're at, or if they're illegal or something like that. Are you likely to answer the door when FEMA comes knocking, looking to do an assessment of your property? Are you going to show up to the the local gymnasium where the nonprofits have set up tables to give away resources, right? You're probably not going to go to that because you don't want to give your name, and they might ask for a social security number or some sort of identification. You're less likely to provide that. And say you're a part of that population who's leaving. In many cases, you're leaving sometimes with nothing but the shirt on your back, and that literally just the shirt on your back. So you end up getting to new areas, and you don't have that identification that may be required. You don't have proof of you can't get a library card in some places without 2 or 3 forms of identification and a letter from one of your utilities to your address. And so now, how do you get an apartment? How do you get a new job? That's some real problems. And again, that's the social ripple effect that's happening surrounding these events. So when we talk about vulnerability assessment, I want to spend just a little more time on social vulnerability, right? Socially vulnerable groups are more likely to have. There's people within those groups that are more likely to have issues, right? And that's the young, the very old, anyone who suffers impairment, anything like that. Those people are the effects, again, because they find themselves in an even more vulnerable group. That vulnerability is just multiplied by the vulnerability that they already find themselves in. Households have most of their wealth in homes, and so they say that your house is probably the most expensive thing you're ever gonna buy. And so if all your money's tied up in your home and you lose your home, it's not as if the insurance company comes out and writes you a check the day after, and so you may be in dire straits for a while. And households with high social vulnerability often occupy areas most likely to be hit by disasters, and also occupy the oldest, often poorly maintained buildings. So data can be combined on hazard exposure, structural lifeline vulnerability, and social vulnerability in a vulnerability hotspot analysis. And so we can basically take all of these things, put them together, and we can identify the most vulnerable groups and populations. It's fascinating. Unfortunately, and I'll end with this, we're not doing anything with it, right? These hotspot analysis might be done, but what are we really doing to sort of mitigate those communities? What are we doing to help sort of alleviate some of the social pressure and that ripple that happens after an event? What are we doing to help those communities? I think that is where, honestly, our faith-based nonprofits and to some degree organizations like Ohio Christian University, who have an emergency management program, it really is our comparative advantage. It's what we're trying to bring to the table, that we have by design. It's part of our DNA, a desire and a command, really, from God to care for the poor, care for the orphan, care for the widow. And so it's part of our DNA. So I think honestly, we should be doing it better. So that's sort of vulnerability in a nutshell. Again, I'm just touching on some main points. I would encourage you to dig deeper into it, and I'm sure the concept's going to come up later down the road as we sort of continue to talk about this and what this looks like to serve and to sort of respond to people in crises and emergencies. So thank you.